Welcome back. I'm Jeanne Meserve. We are all seeing and experiencing the splintering of our media ecosystem. Traditional media outlets, particularly newspapers, are struggling to survive while we have seen a proliferation of digital platforms. The result has been an erosion of editorial guardrails, the proliferation of mis and disinformation, and the polarization of our public. Here with me to discuss, we have Nicolaou, who is U.S. media correspondent for the Financial Times, Zaid A, who is head of U.S. public policy at Cloudflare, and also Vivian Schiller, executive director of Aspen Digital. Great to have you all with us today. So, Zaid, we just heard Maria Ressa speak very passionately about the impact, the negative impact she thinks social media has had on democracy. As someone who worked for Facebook, and I hate to go back to your previous life, but we're going to do it here, I'd love to hear your perspective on what impact you think social media has had on facts, on polarization, on political discourse in this country.
So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be invited to the summit to speak. I was going to make a joke about being the token male on the panel, but it doesn't go over as well when there's not an audience. Yeah, I worked at Facebook for about 4.5 years, and my role there was I was on a team called Strategic Response Policy, and our team's job was to respond to any number of events as they were happening in real time. And this was anything from a school shooting, a terrorist incident, a mass shooting. It could have been a controversial statement that somebody had on Facebook, and reviewing that and whether or not that statement needed to be removed. I normally dealt with really high profile things, so statements from politicians, from heads of state, those kinds of issues. So in general, I think that technology and social media is a tool, right? And it comes with risks. Social media wasn't built for people to use them in the way that some people are using them, that I do think are having negative impacts on democracy and democratic initiatives. That's a risk that comes with it. But I think you also have to look at the way in which social media has been used to support democracy and to support particularly marginalized groups. And so I think of, in the United States, the Women's March was something that initially started from a Facebook post that somebody put in, a woman in Hawaii, put on her Facebook page. And then what we saw take place, back in 2017 was the result of that post. There was the Green Revolution in Iran, and that was mostly organized on Twitter and on social media. So we can see ways in which social media is used for good, and then we also see, unfortunately, ways in which social media is not used as intended, and people use it to chip away at democracy in a number of different ways. And I think you can see that things as recent as January 6th.
Anna, would you say overall that the effect of social media has been positive or negative for democracy?
Well, that's the loaded question of our era, I guess I would say. I think Zaid makes a great point. There seem to be just these extreme pros and cons of social media. You mentioned how it's kind of helped other groups to have a voice. Look at, George Floyd. That became a big story because someone was there filming it and then posted it online. We didn't have that 20 years ago. So it's hard to definitively say yes or no to this. So I'm kind of punting a bit. But I have spent, the past 4 or 5 years kind of both observing as a person and writing about for my job. Obviously there have been this proliferation of disinformation, misinformation, false information online coming from a variety of different actors and commercially motivated people. And that really does seem to have chipped away at a lot of, especially working in the media, the trust in the media, which is really important when you're trying to just communicate things to the public, even things that shouldn't be controversial, such as, vaccine information. It's become this super politically charged topic in the US specifically.
Vivian, Anna just mentioned trust. Survey after survey shows that trust in the media has declined. Social media is part of it, but do you think some of the erosion of trust is in a way deserved?
Well, yeah, it's there's so many different factors that go into the decline of trust in media. It's really hard to pick just one, and a lot of them are factors that have nothing to do with whether or not news organizations deserve that lack of trust or not. Things like the decimation of local media, the flattening effect of news sources on social media, where it makes it hard to tell one from another. But to your specific question, certainly there is a whole gigantic cohort of, I'm not going to even call them news organizations, I will call them publishers or propagandists who put out content that is not based in anything that you or I would recognize as journalistic standards. But even the best news organizations, those who do pride themselves and are high quality and adhere to journalistic standards, even those news organizations are struggling with rising to the moment of 2022 and how they can address and report on some unprecedented kind of forces that we're seeing in America. So whether they deserve it or not, there's some change in norms in news organizations that are definitely needed.
So you and I both come out of a mainstream media organization. You've worked for many. We worked together at CNN. And it just seems to me that we've seen, for instance, an erosion of the line that used to separate editorial content from reporting. We have seen whataboutism. Are all of those things helping to corrode our trust in media?
Right. Well, the two things you mentioned are a problem, but I see sort of maybe bigger issues, which is, how do you report on the unprecedented number of lies that we see coming from figures that news organizations are used to reporting on, if skeptically, at least, parroting their words because it's the president of the United States or it's some other major figure. And how do you continue, how as a news organization, whether you're a CNN or a New York Times or what have you, how do you not appear, they're trying to find a balance between not appearing to be the opposition, because no news organization wants to be, perceived as being on a side. And yet in this country right now, most of the lies are coming from one party and not another, not all, but most. And so it's very hard. I think news organizations are trying to find that balance of not appearing to be sort of, boosters for the left, which they're not, by continuously reporting on so many lies that are coming out of the right. This is just a fact. And how to report on those without unwittingly becoming amplifiers of misinformation by repeating those lies. And the third thing I would say that news organizations are struggling with now is how, the notion of both siderism, I guess, which is, how do you report on things like the efficacy of vaccines or climate change or the results of the 2020 presidential elections, where there is clearly evidence-based reality and then there's falsehoods. So some issues, there really are no two sides. And how do you address that? I think this is very difficult for many news organizations at this time.
Anna, has the advent of social media forced some so-called mainstream media outlets to embrace polarization and abandon what were some of the norms of journalism?
I mean, I think to an extent, most of what we would call mainstream media groups have stayed pretty much the course. I think right now what's happening is this kind of examination of how we do things and how we might do them better. And you're seeing, startups coming up saying, there's clearly a problem here. We need to figure out what to do. So the Bloomberg media CEO is starting a new venture. So I think there's experimentation happening right now, but I think for the most part, I think things have stayed pretty much stagnant. And we're just more recently seeing changes in kind of the way people are approaching reporting and trying to build trust. The New York Times has a new team entirely devoted to that. They're experimenting with things like how you describe reporters before you kind of view the story. So I think right now we're in the middle of trying to figure out how these companies can fit into this new world where people are so polarized and have so much distrust of different sources.
Anna, since you work on the financial side of this to some degree, would you talk a little bit about the impact of the hedge funds who have come in and vacuumed up a lot of news outlets, newspapers in particular?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time reporting on this because I'm a financial news reporter. So there have been really in the past 5 years this kind of massive influx of financial investors coming in, viewing newspapers as just distressed assets in a very unemotional way, because that's how they operate. And effectively what's happened is more and more of these newspapers are shutting down. They're becoming, a shell of what they were before. And there is kind of this rising sentiment that we're losing local news reporting in a way that is actually impacting our democracy. Some universities have done a lot of research on this, connecting, having a local news source, whether it's a newspaper or whatever it might be, to whether people are willing to vote, for example. So I think in recent years, there's been this proliferation of financial groups into the US news industry in a way that they really haven't been historically.
I'm wondering, Vivian, whether you think philanthropy has an important role to play in resuscitating some of these outlets.
Absolutely. It's already had a tremendous impact. I think that the sustainability of news organizations, particularly at the local level, is going to depend on a wide range of revenue sources. Gone are the days of the traditional two revenue source model for local newspapers, which was advertising and subscriptions. Now, for many, it requires sort of a real variety, and philanthropy has a huge part to play, especially as many local news organizations are going the not-for-profit route. And we've seen so many philanthropic organizations step up to support news. It's very heartening, and many of us are working with philanthropic organizations to see how they can invest even more.
Do you think that's a long-term solution?
Well, like I said, the long-term solution requires a wide variety of revenue streams. I think that there will always be a role for philanthropy, but do I think that the entirety of the future of journalism should rest on philanthropic funding? Absolutely not.
Zaid, Facebook faced off with Australia over whether it should be paying for the content that it was repurposing from mainstream news outlets. Is that a viable approach?
Well, I'd have to say I didn't work on that, and so I don't have a lot that I can add, sort of firsthand or anything like that. Of course, I heard about it. I think part of that's a business decision, and I think part of that comes down to whether or not the news organizations, they, in that case, they obviously had got, they obviously went to the Australian lawmakers, and, Australia was going to pass this law that was going to force social media companies to pay, et cetera. Or they did pass law. That's a completely different thing than, should social media, because the way technology has developed, is responsible for making sure that news organizations don't have to deal with the way in which our society has progressed, right? Like I don't necessarily think that social media should be responsible for traditional media. And I also don't
even
think
if they're using their content.
Well, you're using their content because people are sharing it. So it's not like social media is surviving only because the newspapers are posting their content on social media. The journalists themselves are using social media to post their content. You look at I shouldn't say any. You look at most reporters' Twitter feeds, Facebook feeds. they are tweeting out their articles. They want people to see it. They are sharing it. They want other people to see it. They want other people to tag them. So this has become part of their culture as well. It's not just something that the social media companies are doing.
Anna, as the financial reporter amongst us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can see both sides of the argument. I think Vivian actually made a good point in saying, it's not going to be one thing here. So it's not going to be just philanthropy. It's not just going to be money from Facebook and Google or ads or subscriptions. I think every media company at this point has to kind of have a hodgepodge of all these things to survive and to do well. In terms of the actual, I mean, the showdown, I guess, in Australia between, the Murdochs and Facebook, I mean, I think it was definitely interesting. It's an open question of, how much they owe to publishers. The comparison publishers or advocates of this would make is that, it's similar to television where the cable companies have to pay the producers of the content, right? I'm not sure that I buy that that's, a direct comparison that we can make here. I do think, though, that in general, there's some way in which some kind of money should be exchanged here. I don't know if it should be as direct as just paying them or if it's making investments, hiring journalists, creating nonprofits, things like that. But it's certainly been a fun story to kind of observe.
Vivian, it's estimated that 65 million Americans, I think, live in what are called local news deserts. You've referenced the decline of local media. I'm wondering, the standard line seems to be that local media helps foster civic engagement and is an add-on for democracy. Is there any empirical truth to that?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of data. I'm sorry, I don't have it at the ready, but I've seen there's been a number of studies that indicate that in areas where there is a more vibrant local press and people who consume that local press feel more connected to their community, they feel more connected to each other, they're more civically engaged, they vote at higher rates. So there's ample evidence, and the absence of local news outlets, by which I mean local reporters writing about local issues. In the absence, into that void flows all kinds of, because nature abhors a vacuum, you end up with, closed Facebook groups, or a lot of, rumor mongering on Nextdoor, or just, people texting and chatting each other, or these pink slime sites that are really, are masquerading as legitimate news organizations, but are really sort of run outside of the community by partisan actors. Those can, on the contrary, those can create more division within the community. So there's plenty of data about this.
Anna, I think you took a look at an AP article that was written about a Minnesota newspaper, a local newspaper, which was struggling to survive. And it was having trouble surviving because its community was already so polarized, and it was having trouble finding advertisers and finding readers. So here was an instance where local media still existed, but the obstacles that had been created by, one presumes, from social media discourse and our political discourse made it difficult. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was super interesting to see, because we have been making this assumption, right, that, well, what's missing is a local newspaper, and then people will be more engaged and they're more willing to trust someone that they can, physically see going into a courthouse and covering something, rather than someone, writing something from New York or San Francisco about a town they don't know about. I think what that article showed us that the problem fundamentally is about trust. And it's also about the fact that due to the internet and social media, there are just so many different places you can find information right now, whether it be true or false. You can find pretty much anything you want to hear at this point online. So I think that opens up another conversation about, how we educate people in this country, how we, bring in even, media courses. I definitely didn't study anything like that in high school. Just about, how to know what sources are credible, how to kind of see the connection between a source and the information and biases that are apparent in kind of most organizations. I think at that point, it becomes more about education than the financial part of it.
Vivian, I'm wondering if you think that sort of media literacy education is going to take effect fast enough.
Yeah, well, that's the question. You know, there are short-term solutions and long-term solutions. I don't think media literacy is a short-term solution, but to begin to, you know, introduce that kind of discipline in schools with kids at a young age. And again, we're not talking about, you know, telling kids what news organizations they should read or not read or watch or not watch. We're just talking about, you know, understanding, as Anna was talking about, what it is what you're looking at and what are the motivations is critical for this young generation who are going to grow up to, you know, lead, to be the future leaders. So not everything, there are other things we can do in the short term, but I think also simultaneously looking at this sort of longer term roadmap is really important to the future of democracy.
I'd love to work in an audience question here. Rachel from the Core Bell School has a question for you, Zaid. She asked, is there a way to leverage social media to help the public be more informed and limit disinformation at the same time? What do you think?
I will answer that, but before that, I just want to kind of respond to this, the sort of this overarching theme that I'm hearing that I don't necessarily buy into, which is that there seems to be this this idea that social media caused polarization, and that is simply just not true. Like, our country has been polarized for a long time, and you know, people are using social media, and it has become, I think that the polarization in some ways is more evident, but I think it has been there for a long time. And I think sometimes the press in our history has contributed to that. We saw recently that the Kansas City Star apologized for the way in which they covered the Black community or didn't cover the Black community, and how they, a local newspaper, the most influential newspaper in Kansas City, how their coverage of what happened to the Black community really impacted the way in which African Americans in Kansas City, as well as in the United States, you know, were thought about. Like, I think that, and that's just one example, and it's not the only example, you know, there are lots of other ones. I think that with George Floyd that Anna mentioned, I think that a lot of people in the African American community, when George Floyd happened, it was like, we feel seen. We've been saying this all along. We've been saying that these things are happening, that there has been police brutality, that people are needlessly dying at the hands of law enforcement, unfortunately. And instead, the police reports that are filed, the stories that get told about what happened is completely devoid of reality. And I think that you know, that was happening before. What social media did was you know, somebody filmed it and they spread it around. And so there was more awareness and people had to confront it and face it. And before, when we didn't have that, when you didn't have the opportunity to do that, it was easy to kind of swipe certain things under the rug, and it wasn't there. The polarization has always been there. I think that we are seeing a lot more of it now because there are more things to see in terms of like social media, in terms of different you know, blogs or handles or whatever. But it's not like it was created when Twitter or Facebook or whatever was created. So I feel like I need to put that marker down, because I don't want people to walk away with this this view that everything was fine and then social media was invented and then all of a sudden our country was polarized, because that's definitely not the case.
Zaid, I'm going to stop you there before you answer this question and see if Vivian wants to respond to what you just said.
I did, yeah, because I just think what Zaid is saying is such an important point. There is a misperception in certain corners, and I hear it, it drives me crazy, that there was a good old days of journalism back before social media, back when, you know, when there was no internet and it was just, you know, TV and Walter Cronkite and all of that. And if only, you know, the country was united, and if only we could go back to those days. But, you know, for huge numbers of Americans, their stories were not being told, their stories were not being represented. They were not represented in newsrooms. it was very much about a certain ilk of, white America reporting on other parts of white America. So there are many things about the current state of journalism, and I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing in terms of the entrepreneurship and the growth of new news outlets all over the country that are springing up to cover the stories of underrepresented communities, told by underrepresented communities.
Now, Zaid, I want to get back to the question from Rachel, which was, is there a way to leverage social media to help the public be more informed and limit disinformation at the same time?
The limiting different disinformation part is very tricky. And I will say that I think a lot of social media sites, even though, I mean, people talk about their First Amendment right all the time. And I love to point out that social media, like the First Amendment applies to the government, does not apply to social media, does not apply to private companies. That being said, social media companies still see, like we want to promote free expression. We want people to have conversations. And it gets really tricky when, one person's, free expression just turns out to be misinformation. Like, how do you deal with that? I think we're seeing that play out right now with Spotify and how they're dealing with Joe Rogan, and they are seeing a backlash. They are dealing with, well, what do we do? One of the ways in which they are dealing with it is they said, well, we are going to have authoritative information in addition to things that are said on Joe Rogan's show. At Facebook, as well as, at Twitter, I know a lot of people know that there are misinformation labels, where there are labels on certain types of or certain content where I say we, but I don't work there anymore, where the social media companies either try to direct you to more authoritative information. I know there have been some studies on whether or not that works. I think I'm not sure, but I do think it's helpful to have that authoritative information attached. A lot of people have probably noticed that if you mention COVID, in a Facebook post, you're more likely to get this little I at the bottom that, leads you to the authority, whether or not it's misinformation or not. So it's just easier to sort of sometimes blanket certain types of speech with, well, here's a link to some information if you need it, or if you want to read a little bit further. I think that that's helpful to have. I'm not so sure how many people are clicking on it. I've never clicked on one of them, but I also don't spread information about COVID or anything else. But I do think that it's helpful in one way. I think that social media can help is to label and to give people authoritative sources. Another way in which they can do it, in addition to labeling, is to put content in people's news feeds, regardless of whether or not they are looking at misinformation. So just, this can be done with COVID. It can be done with voting information. Here's voting information in your state for these upcoming elections. Here's where you need to go to register. Here are the deadlines, et cetera. So I do think that that social media companies can and do and should provide that kind of information for people that comes directly from the company, instead of necessarily just people relying on what's in their newsfeed from their family and friends.
Anna, we have a question for you from Clayton, who is a Corbell student. He asks, what do you see to be the biggest shared challenges between the United States and Europe within the media landscape?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, Europe in general, back in 2014, I was working in Brussels, and this was, pre-Trump, pre the whole fake news thing. And already there was a lot of hostility towards big tech within the European Union. So I think Europe in general has always been a lot more rigorous, I guess you would say, in terms of how they're approaching big tech and privacy and things like that. I think in general, Europe has kind of led the way, and the US has followed a bit in terms of how the government should approach things. And I think that the two could probably work together a bit more. But I think culturally there's a big difference. And it's only been really in more recent years that the US has had this techlash that we talk about. Because even, during the Obama era, it was very kind of he was very sympathetic to these big tech companies. So there's been a really big shift in the US in the past, 3 or 4 or 5 years, whereas Europe has had that, I don't want to call it hostility, but definitely a different attitude towards it historically.
Vivian, a question from Scott in Denver, who asks, if the content funnel is so overstuffed with seemingly endless options of audio, visual, and social media programming, how does sober news content manage to attract attention these days without resorting to partisan shouting?
Well, this is the big question. But I will reject the sort of binary nature that something is either boring or partisan shouting. I think that reporting that is not is not biased, is not partisan, is not shouty can be. I mean, we could spend the rest of the day pointing to endless examples in print, in podcasting, in documentaries of riveting narrative journalism that tells really important stories and reveal important truths, and bear witness to some of the most important, wonderful and disturbing things happening around the world. And so, but yeah, for sure, I having been a part of many news organizations, what's goes under different names, audience development, finding audience, engaging with the public is hard in a noisy environment.
Here's another question. This is from Kylie, a Corbell School student. Zaid, I'm going to throw this one at you, and you addressed it to some degree earlier, but Kylie asks, does media embolden partisanship, or does partisanship embolden media? Which comes first?
The chicken or the egg?
Yep.
I mean, I think I've got to say, I don't see, for the most part, media emboldening partisanship. I do think, as Vivian, talked about earlier, this both sides. And so I do think that sometimes when the media feels necessary, one, not to look like they are being biased, and sometimes reporting on both sides, or sometimes reporting about the misinformation, one of the negative, consequences of that is that a story lives on or gets more news time than it should. And I don't think that that's the intent. I think that that ends up being the consequence of the way in which a lot of news organizations want to cover something. They want to put the other side in there, and instead, sometimes, like Vivian said, that you just, she didn't say this, but you need to call a spade, right? And you need to say that something is not true. I have noticed that on the TV that I watch, that a lot of the times, particularly when talking about fraud in the 2020 election or the lack thereof, a lot of reporters are saying, they will make a comment, they will say the thing that whatever pundit or politician has said, and they will say there is no evidence that there was fraud in the widespread fraud in the 2020 election. To me, that seems new, and it seems a little bit different than here's what the other side says. To me, it is very intentional. This is the claim that they made, and it's not true. And I think that to me seems that seems newer, and I don't think was necessarily the case, 5 years ago, that people were doing it that way.
Vivian, I saw you nodding your head while Zaid was speaking. Did you want to add on there?
Yeah, just maybe some of you are familiar with the tactic that has come to be known as the truth sandwich, which is, when you report on falsehoods, you don't put it in you don't put falsehood in the headline, you don't put the falsehood in the tweet, you sandwich that falsehood between what is the factual evidence-based reality. You report on the falsehood, which perhaps you're reporting on because it was uttered by, say, the President of the United States, and then you follow with additional context that makes sure that the reader, the listener, or the viewer understands where that lie, what context that lie exists in. So it's a good tactic, and it's a memorable image for people.
And I want to pitch this question in your direction. Jonathan from Denver asked, why do you think so many Americans are so susceptible to Russian propaganda?
Oh, I mean, I think people are susceptible to propaganda in general. I mean, to touch a bit about what Zaid was saying, that this chicken or the egg problem, I teach a course at City College about media and politics, and pretty much every class ended up being about, is the press, is social media a reflection of our society, or is it driving forward these problems? And I don't know that the answer lies in taking a strong stance on either side of that. I think a lot of it really is about raising these questions and thinking critically about them. And I think a lot of it goes back to education and media literacy and all these kind of things that I really don't think we've thought about much or done much about since we've had this rise of social media and just the way that propaganda can reach us in ways that it really couldn't before. In the traditional TV world, you wouldn't turn on your TV and see something coming out of, teenagers in Macedonia. That just wasn't happening. Now everyone has access to everything online. So I don't know that it's Americans in particular are susceptible to it. I think it's the problem again of just not being trained to think about the motives behind everything you're reading.
I'd love to give you each just about 20 seconds to say, what do you think the future of media is going to look like? Are we going to be able to grapple with these very fundamental questions about the impact of the new environment? Vivian, you want to start that?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes, because I can't face a world where the answer to that is no. So, all of us on this panel are all working towards a healthier, better than the past news environment where everybody's voice is represented. It is rooted in evidence and reality, and we can begin to come together around some common truths.
Zaid, where do you think we're going?
I agree. I mean, I'm generally optimistic about nearly everything, So I'm going to say yes, that we will learn to adapt. I also want to make an analogy to Netflix and traditional TV and cable, and now all these new streaming services, right? Is that like ABC, NBC, CBS, they are having to adapt to Netflix. A lot of them have their own. Peacock now is part of the NBC family. Like this is the traditional TV adapting to streaming services. And I think that we're going to see the same thing in the news media, that they have adapted, they are continuing to adapt, and they will adapt. It's just, we're moving forward as a society.
Anna, a quick glimpse into the future?
I'm a historic pessimist, but I'm going to try to be optimistic for the sake of this panel. I mean, I think one thing I would say is, in life in general, the first step of fixing something is knowing you have a problem and noticing that. So we have definitely noticed there's a problem. And now I think what is the glass half full thing is that there are a lot of people trying to figure it out right now. There are a lot of smart people working on this, from Facebook to news organizations to, citizens. So I would hope that someone can come up with something that will be sustainable and work for the future.
And we have to leave it there. Anna Nicolaou, Vivian Schiller, and Zaid A. Thank you all for joining us for this great discussion. It's been terrific to have you here.
Thank you.
And ahead, we'll be talking about vote manipulation. Stay with us.